There I saw Judge Miriam Blackwood, draped in black robes, gavel poised glaring at the woman who had just torched a sitting judge's home. The audacity of it made my jaw ache from clenching. But Bryn Ashworth Sterling had no clue what she'd stepped into. When you set fire to a judge's sanctuary, you'd better pray she never gets the chance to repay the favor through the law. And I was more than ready to deliver a feast of justice with prison time as the main course. Bryn, Pinewood's self-appointed queen of control, thought burning down my house would silence me. Instead, she ignited something that would devour her entire corrupt little empire. Every shady fine, every fabricated claim, every intimidation tactic documented and preserved. And now, my destroyer had strolled willingly into my courtroom and placed herself neatly on my legal chopping block. 6 months earlier, I was still Judge Miriam Blackwood, respected, feared by criminals, and utterly broken. Cancer had stripped Harold away piece by piece, and I had just lowered my husband of 28 years into the ground. Our craftsman home, once full of laughter and quiet love, had turned into nothing more than a tomb. Pinewood Estates used to be a haven for teachers, factory workers, and retirees. Neighbors planted flowers, kids played in the street, and modest houses stood steady. Then came the money. Ranch homes toppled for oversized palaces with triple garages and wine cellars. Property taxes soared, forcing out the old guard of people like Walt Henderson, who'd been there since the 60s. And leading the gentrification crusade was Bryn Ashworth Sterling. Imagine every stereotype of the smug suburban tyrant. Now give her luxury sportswear, a silver Tesla worth more than the average annual salary, and the certainty that she knew better than everyone else. At 45, smooth in hand, she saw herself as Pinewood's savior. Her definition of improving the neighborhood, erasing anyone who didn't fit her picture-perfect vision. I first met her while building the privacy fence Harold and I had planned during his last months, a 6-foot sanctuary where we'd intended to drink coffee and watch the sunrise. Hidden from the world, the roses Harold had nurtured for 15 years still bloomed in the garden that morning, their fragrance a bittersweet comfort. Then came the crunch of designer boots across fallen leaves. You must be the widow, she said, not an ounce of sympathy, just judgment. Judge Blackwood, I corrected, wiping soil from my palms. Right, the judge. She said the word like it was contagious. Then she introduced herself. Bryn, co-president. Without another word, she snapped open a pink tape measure like a weapon and started inspecting my fence. Her lips pinched as if each inch offended her. 6'2". Our rules clearly say 6 feet maximum. That's a $500 violation, plus removal. I rose slowly, bone stiff from grief. Show me that regulation. She flipped through her leather portfolio, pages clicking under manicured nails. After several minutes, she found nothing, because no such rule existed. My fence was exactly 6 feet. I'd hired a licensed surveyor just to make sure. Her spray-tan face flushed. We'll see about that, Judge. The venom in her voice told me everything. This wasn't about a fence. That night, over leftover dinner and Harold's favorite bourbon, I dug into court records. And there it was, a Sterling Premium Builders, her husband's company, had once stood in my courtroom, accused of scamming an elderly veteran out of $30,000 for unnecessary roof work. I'd ruled against them and referred the case for fraud investigation. This fence nonsense was nothing more than revenge. But Bryn had chosen the wrong opponent. I'd spent 2 decades sentencing killers, liars, and predators without flinching. I had already faced the slow agony of watching the man I loved wither and die, yet still honored him with dignity. I was a woman with nothing left to lose and intimate knowledge of every loophole, weapon, and strategy the legal system could provide. That fence was not just wood and nails. It was memory. It was love. It was the last project Harold and I ever dreamed together. And Bryn Ashworth Sterling had just declared war on that sanctuary. In my courtroom, there's a phrase for this level of arrogance: Exhibit A. Within 2 weeks, her campaign escalated into a full-blown assault. She masked her vendetta as law enforcement, but it was psychological warfare. The letters began arriving in thick, official-looking envelopes, my mailman apologizing as he handed them over. 7 certified violations in 10 days, each more ridiculous than the last. The first, unapproved decorative garden feature. The target, Harold's memorial stone, a simple granite marker inscribed in memory of love that grows eternal. According to Bryn, it clashed with Pinewood's landscape standards. The second, mailbox non-compliant with regulations. My black mailbox had been there since the Reagan era. Now, she claimed it was disruptive to neighborhood aesthetics, but the third only of that one made my blood run hot. Excessive bird feeding. She wanted to fine me for the single feeder that drew in cardinals, Harold's favorite birds. Watching them with my morning coffee had become my ritual, my way of keeping him near. Each violation demanded fines ranging from a few hundred to thousands, with threats of liens and legal action. The letterhead and paper were probably more expensive than the supposed infractions, but Bryn had no idea who she was dealing with. I knew Colorado whole law inside and out. I'd memorized the statutes back in law school after fending off a shady landlord. Her citations were riddled with holes. Real fines had to be reasonable, tied to actual violations, and based on bylaws formally adopted. Hers fabricated nonsense with no hearings, no due process. And so, it was time for judicial payback. For 3 nights, I sat in Harold's old study, surrounded by his shelves of law books, preparing my counterattack. The air in Harold's study was thick with the must of old law books as I pieced together my counteroffensive. I filed a formal complaint with the Colorado Real Estate Commission, outlining every one of Bryn's procedural violations. I photographed every inch of my property, built spreadsheets tracking her bogus fines, and cataloged every false citation. My years of evidence preservation training were no longer just skills, they were weapons. But Bryn wasn't done. While I was downtown sentencing drunk drivers, my security cameras caught her latest act of arrogance. She showed up with reinforcements, an interior designer draped in white like a ghost, and a personal trainer apparently masquerading as a property inspector. For 2 hours they staged a performance of evidence gathering, documenting imaginary violations. The designer gestured dramatically at Harold's roses, as if decades of care offended her curated aesthetic. The trainer, clearly more comfortable with barbells than bylaws, scribbled notes on an official-looking clipboard. That evening, I watched the footage, fury rising. They weren't enforcing rules, they were fabricating them. In court, we'd call it exactly what it was: conspiracy to commit fraud. Just then, my neighbor Walt Henderson knocked on the door, his pipe smoke mixing with the cool evening air. In hushed tones, he warned me, "Judge, this Bryn woman's been targeting folks left and right. Remember the Rodriguez's? She fined them until they tore out their Virgin of Guadalupe statuette, said it was non-conforming. $800 later, they sold their home and left." My instincts sharpened. "Who else?" I asked. Walt's eyes darkened. "Single mom down the block got ticketed for her kids' chalk art, rainbows and hopscotch. For God's sake." Bryn called it defacing neighborhood aesthetics. The pattern snapped into place as if a closing argument were unfolding before me. This wasn't a feud about fences. Bryn had built a harassment machine, using the hoe as her weapon. Her targets? Families who didn't fit her ideal of Pinewood perfection, Hispanic homeowners, single mothers, elderly neighbors living on pensions. And now, me, a widowed judge who had once ruled against her husband's shady construction company. This was systemic discrimination, cloaked in bureaucratic language and backed by fabricated fines. I hadn't just stumbled into a personal battle. I'd uncovered an organized racket. As I took notes, the scratching of my pen echoed in Harold's office. He always said that strong legal strategy was like surgery: precise, calculated, and devastating when applied correctly. Bryn was about to experience the full scalpel treatment. She'd made the fatal mistake of picking a fight with someone who not only knew the rules of engagement but had written half of them. Harold used to tease that judges were referees with law degrees and permanent attitudes. It was time to remind Bryn that she'd picked the wrong opponent. Her next move crossed a line even she couldn't pretend was legal. If phony violations wouldn't break me, she would escalate to trespassing. While I was downtown sentencing a domestic abuser, my cameras caught her slipping into my yard under the pretense of a so-called emergency inspection, a power that existed only in her imagination. She strutted through my backyard in yoga pants, tape measure dangling from one hand, photographing my home like a paparazzo on assignment. The low point, she pressed her face against my kitchen window, peering inside at Harold's coffee mug, still on the counter where he left it. I hadn't been able to move it. Then came the cruelest act. On camera, she yanked open my back gate, checked the latch to make sure it wouldn't close, and walked away with a satisfied smirk. When I returned home that night, weary from testimony in another domestic violence case, I found the gate wide open and my worst fear realized. Gavel, my 14-year-old tabby, was gone. He wasn't just a pet. Harold had found him shivering under a car during a thunderstorm and brought him home as his last gift to me. That cat had curled in Harold's lap through chemo sessions, purring against the pain. He was my last living link to 28 years of love. Panic hit me like a body blow. For 3 days I searched, calling his name through alleys, storm drains, and backyards. Walt rallied neighbors to help. Even the Rodriguezes returned from their new town to join the search. Then came the phone call that froze me solid. Dr. Martinez from Mountain View Animal Emergency, Judge Blackwood, someone brought in a cat that matches your description. Has a broken bar in rough shape. I rushed there to find Gavel in an oxygen tent, barely conscious, broken ribs, dehydration, shock. After $800 of emergency surgery, the vet explained, these injuries are consistent with being chased by machinery, leaf blowers, maybe landscaping equipment. The stress nearly killed him. The security footage confirmed it. 1 hour after Bryn's unlawful entry, her landscaping crew had arrived with industrial blowers. They'd cornered Gavel, driven him into the open gate she'd left, and chased him until he collapsed in a storm drain. This wasn't harassment anymore. This was attempted murder of my family. Bryn had just crossed into felony territory, and she'd chosen a target who knew exactly how to turn her crimes into legal annihilation. I changed the locks, posted no trespassing signs, and filed charges for unlawful entry and animal cruelty. Then I called Sarah Morgan, Channel 7's Bulldog reporter who specialized in exposing suburban corruption. Judge vs. Home, When Watchdogs Attack aired 3 nights later. Sarah's report showed this footage of Bryn's trespassing, the landscaping attack on Gavel, and the wider pattern of discrimination. The public reaction was explosive. Donations poured in to cover Gavel's medical bills and my legal war chest. Justice for Gavel became a social media movement. 3 law firms offered free representation. The Attorney General's office called me directly about possible civil rights violations. More victims came forward, too. An elderly widow forced to dismantle her husband's memorial garden. The Johnsons, bankrupted after Bryn fined them for installing a wheelchair ramp for their disabled son. Case after case formed a damning pattern of abuse. And then, in the dry text of property statutes, I found my nuclear weapon. Unlawful entry with intent to intimidate carried the same weight as burglary. Add in animal cruelty and conspiracy, and her landscaping crew's actions weren't just petty, they were predicates for federal RICO charges. That night, Gavel finally curled on my chest again, purring weakly. The sound mingled with the steady hum of my new security system as I drafted the complaints that would end Bryn's reign for good. Harold always said judges were referees with long memories. It was time to remind Bryn what happens when you torture a federal judge's family. She had escalated from petty citations to felony assault. My response would be biblical. And when Bryn realized her trespassing had detonated into federal charges, she went nuclear. Her next move wasn't just desperate, it was designed to destroy me entirely. On a Tuesday morning, a letter landed on my desk under Official Judicial Discipline Commission letterhead. The accusations inside made my coffee taste like ash. According to Bryn's complaint, Judge Miriam Blackwood was abusing her bench to terrorize law-abiding homeowners, twisting the law for personal vendettas. Her lies read like bad fiction. The so-called evidence Bryn submitted was a masterpiece of fraud. She produced doctored photographs that made Harold's memorial garden look like a junk heap, staged witness statements from her trainer and designer claiming I had threatened them, and falsified timestamps so sloppy a first-year forensics student would laugh them out of court. Her ultimate play, though, was to weaponize public opinion. She leaked her lies to partisan blogs still seething over my past environmental rulings. By the end of the day, headlines blared, "Liberal Judge Terrorizes Patriotic Home." Within hours, the internet lit up with impeachment demands, disbarment threats, and a storm of creative punishments for activist judges who hate America. For 3 days I sat there, watching 2 decades of service as a federal judge get torn to pieces by people who couldn't spell jurisprudence, yet suddenly thought themselves experts in constitutional law. And then a salvation arrived. A silver-haired woman knocked on my door, balancing a plate of homemade cookies. Patricia Pat Donnelly looked like the quintessential retired librarian: a cardigan, orthopedic shoes, and slightly trembling hands. What she didn't look like was what she truly was, a former FBI agent with 25 years in financial crimes, who had quietly been keeping tabs on Bryn for weeks. "Judge, you'll want to see this," she said calmly, settling into Harold's chair like it was her own. Then she laid photographs across my kitchen table as if we were in the middle of a high-stakes card game. "This," she said, tapping one photo, "is Bethany Sterling of Phoenix, Arizona." The face was Bryn's, but the name was different. The file told a story: 3 suspicious insurance claims in 2 years, a flood, an electrical fire, an act of vandalism, all miraculously resolved with payouts totaling nearly $500,000, and each time, she vanished before a grand jury could act. Recognition slammed into me like a verdict being read aloud. This wasn't improvisation, it was her playbook. Move into a neighborhood, manufacture conflict, milk insurance policies, then disappear. Pat's instincts, even in retirement, were sharp as ever. "Here's the best part," she said with a small smile. She filed her current homeowner's policy under a false identity. "That's federal mail fraud." The stack of documents she produced was enough to make any prosecutor salivate. Bryn's $800,000 house was insured for nearly 3 times its value. Her application was a nest of lies: erased identities, falsified claims histories, fabricated financials. "She's not after you because of some old grudge," Pat explained, sorting the evidence with clinical precision. "You're the smokescreen. She uses the HOA as theater to keep everyone distracted while she drains funds and sets up her next fire." The realization hit hard. My battles with fake citations, fences, and roses had been camouflaged. While she had me tied up in nonsense, she was bleeding the hoe dry and preparing another round of insurance fraud that would devastate every family in Pinewood. Pat slid over one last folder thick enough to make a defense attorney choke. Inside were bankruptcy filings for Sterling Premium Builders, their Colorado license suspension for tax evasion, and bank records showing hundreds of thousands siphoned from HOA emergency reserves. "The presidency isn't about power," Pat said flatly. "It's about access to the money." But her final disclosure froze me where I sat. Bryn had already filed preliminary insurance claims citing structural concerns and community safety hazards. My house wasn't just a personal target, it was a pawn in her next stage disaster. That night, I surrounded myself with the mountain of evidence: bank statements showing $340,000 missing, insurance applications riddled with perjury, a documented pattern of targeting minorities and elderly residents that screamed civil rights violations. I finally understood the truth. Bryn hadn't picked me because of my ruling against her husband. She picked me because terrorizing a federal judge was the perfect distraction for her larger criminal scheme. But in her arrogance, she had miscalculated catastrophically. She hadn't chosen a helpless resident as she'd chosen someone who knew how to dismantle criminal enterprises piece by piece, using every weapon the federal legal system allowed. The glow of my computer screen lit Harold's old study as I began drafting letters to federal prosecutors specializing in fraud and civil rights crimes. Harold always believed patience wasn't just a virtue, it was a blade. And when used at the right moment, it cut the deepest. Bryn Ashworth Sterling was about to discover the cost of her arrogance. Running insurance scams while waging war against a federal judge wasn't merely reckless, it was the kind of stupidity that turned life sentences. It was time to teach this suburban criminal what real justice looked like. This was federal justice, but personal. The manila envelope Pat slid across my kitchen table felt heavier than a coffin lid. Inside were photographs that made my pulse spike and my prosecutor's instincts scream. "Judge," Pat said, her voice carrying the gravity of 25 years chasing white-collar predators, "what I'm about to show you changes everything." Bryn Ashworth Sterling doesn't exist. The first photo was a California driver's license from 2018, Rebecca Ashworth, smiling with Bryn's unmistakable face. The next was in Arizona. Ida Beth Sterling, same woman, new name. The third stopped me cold. A 2010 federal prison badge stamped with the name Sandra McKenzie of Detroit. Pat's tone was steady as she arranged the evidence like surgical instruments. She's not a nosy neighbor, Judge. She's a professional community destroyer. 4 states, 6 stolen identities, each infiltration followed by embezzlement, insurance fraud, and vanishing before indictments land. We've tracked over $4 million stolen in the last decade. My judicial mind kicked in automatically, but my voice cracked when I asked, how many families? Pat didn't blink. 15 confirmed. The pattern is always the same: target established neighborhoods, stir up harassment campaigns usually against minorities or the elderly, drain emergency funds, then burn down the most valuable homes for insurance payouts. Her case notes read like a catalog of nightmares. In Sacramento, 3 Hispanic families were driven out before the community center accidentally burned. In Phoenix, 5 elderly residents suffered stress-induced health crises under her reign of terror. Then Pat slid over a document that made my blood run ice cold. Blueprints, architectural plans for my home, annotated with chilling precision, electrical weak points, access to the foundation, and optimal accelerant paths for a staged fire. She's been planning to torch your house since day one, Pat said, her voice low. The citations, the harassment, it was all cover while she set up the perfect arson. On paper, your property is worth $180,000, but with Harold's life insurance upgrades and renovation notes, she can inflate the rebuild to $320,000. And by claiming fire spread to her property, she doubles the payout. My hands shook as I traced Harold's handwriting in the margins of his notes from the electrical upgrades we'd worked on together in his final months. Our love, our sanctuary, had been turned into her criminal blueprint. And then Pat revealed the final twist, one that shattered every assumption I had made. She's not just a fraudster, Judge. She's a fugitive. Real name, Sandra A. Bryn McKenzie. She testified against a Detroit fraud syndicate in 2012, did 18 months in federal prison, and then entered witness protection. She disappeared from the program in 2015 and has been stealing identities ever since, funded by the very system meant to protect her. The implications hit me like a gavel to the skull. A woman the government had sworn to shelter was now using taxpayer-funded identities to run organized crime operations across state lines. Pat didn't sugarcoat it. The witness protection violation alone carries 10 years. Layer on the multi-state fraud conspiracy, identity theft, and attempted arson against the sitting federal judge. A broken bar, she let the sentence hang. A broken bar, she's looking at life without parole. I stared at the photographs of wrecked families and burned-out homes, the faces of elderly residents who had died of heart failure after months of harassment campaigns. My so-called nightmare with the HOA was just the latest chapter in a decade-long crime spree. And it wasn't random. Bryn hadn't chosen me out of old spite. She had researched my husband's death, my financial position, my work schedule, my emotional attachments. She had built a victim profile as carefully as she built her fires, but her arrogance had blinded her. She had made the one mistake no career criminal should ever make. She had chosen to run federal crimes against someone who knew exactly how to dismantle them. I knew how to coordinate multi-jurisdictional prosecutions. FBI, Treasury, state AG's office. This was my arena. Now it was time to show a professional predator what federal justice looked like when it became personal, permanent, and merciless. By Thursday evening, my kitchen had transformed into a war room. Pat, Walt, and attorney Rebecca Morgan sat around Harold's table like avenging angels, surrounded by evidence boxes stacked higher than scripture. Rebecca Morgan was no ordinary lawyer. She was a predator in heels, a former federal prosecutor turned white-collar defense attorney who had never lost a RICO case. She had driven down from Denver with 3 paralegals and a trunk of legal firepower sharp enough to flatten a cartel. Her eyes gleamed with something close to hunger. Judge, she said, unfurling color-coded flowcharts across the table like battlefield maps. This isn't about whole harassment anymore. We're dismantling a 10-year federal crime spree that's stolen over $4 million and gutted 15 communities. The scent of Walt's pipe smoke drifted through the air as we laid out our 3-pronged assault, federal annihilation, state prosecution, civil rights demolition. Rebecca led the charge with surgical precision. Mail fraud across state line as at 20 years. Wire fraud for the electronic theft to another 20. Identity theft while in witness protection at 10 mandatory. RICO conspiracy for systematic community destruction. A life without parole. Her smile was razor thin. Predatory. We're stacking charges that will bury her deeper than climate change. Pat. Operating with retired FBI efficiency, coordinated agency involvement like a general recalling old troops. Colorado Bureau of Investigation, Treasury Financial Crimes, FBI Interstate Fraud Task Force. They're salivating over this. By tomorrow, Brent will be under more federal surveillance than a terror cell. My own role was evidence preservation and victim coordination, skills I had sharpened over 20 years of prosecuting complex conspiracies. Whole finances, I reminded them, were transparent to any resident who knew how to request them properly. Tomorrow we'd demand 5 years of accounting records and watch her embezzlement empire collapse under public sunlight. Meanwhile, Walt mobilized his community intelligence network, 60 years of neighborhood ties woven into a web of informants that would make the CIA envious. Every family she's terrorized is documenting everything, he reported. Mrs. Rodriguez is driving back from Phoenix with 17 witnesses. The Johnsons are cataloging disability discrimination that'll make federal prosecutors cry tears of joy. Our most devastating preparation, though, was technical. Pat had re-engineered my modest home security into a courtroom-grade surveillance grid calibrated for maximum prosecutorial impact. Every camera angle was optimized, every microphone tuned to capture conversations 3 houses away. Here's the beauty, Pat said, testing the equipment. She's still committing crimes while we build the case. Every fraudulent fine, every intimidation letter, every whole transfer, it's all real-time evidence. Rebecca moved with ruthless efficiency. Emergency injunctions would freeze whole accounts in the morning. Criminal complaints would hit 3 jurisdictions simultaneously. Civil rights violations were already being filed with the Colorado Attorney General for systematic targeting of minorities and the elderly. Even the financial fallout had been weaponized. Under the Homeowners Protection Act, insurance companies had to notify mortgage holders of fraud investigations. Brand scams would trigger audits of every Pinewood policy, potentially saving neighbors thousands in premiums while blacklisting her with insurers nationwide. But we weren't Nitel de Macron v. Cornered criminals became dangerous. Rebecca had arranged protective surveillance for vulnerable families, especially the elderly and households with small children. We weren't just prosecuting, we were fortifying. By midnight, Harold's table had become the nerve center of a legal machine designed for one purpose: the total annihilation of Bryn's empire, while protecting every victim she had ever terrorized. The precision was breathtaking, the scope overwhelming, the outcome inevitable. When we're finished, Rebecca said, her voice like a blade sliding from its sheath, she won't just be convicted, she'll be erased. Rebecca delivered the summary like a closing argument. Ben McKenzie spends the rest of her life in federal max. Sterling Premium Builders gets liquidated for restitution. Every resident she harassed gets compensated plus punitive damages. And we set a precedent that shields communities nationwide from predators like her. The quiet hum of my upgraded security system blended with the staccato click of my keyboard as I drafted victim impact statements, crafted not just to inform, but to make federal judges hungry for maximum sentences. Harold always told me patience wasn't passive, patience was a weapon, sharpened when you paired it with overwhelming force delivered at the precise psychological moment. That moment was coming. By tomorrow, Bryn Ashworth Sterling would discover that targeting a federal judge's community wasn't just reckless, it was life sentence stupid, legacy destroying stupid, federal prison until she dies stupid. It was time to execute justice with extreme legal prejudice. But Bryn didn't retreat. She escalated. Her counterstrike confirmed what Pat had warned as she'd graduated from petty harassment to domestic terrorism. The attack came Tuesday afternoon. I was downtown sentencing a repeat wife Petra, a perfect alibi Bryn had lifted straight from my public docket. At 2:47 p.m., my military-grade security grid caught everything in high-definition clarity. 2 unmarked trucks rolled up. The crew that spilled out wasn't landscaping, they were arsonists. moving with the economy of professionals. Cameras captured them laying accelerant trails along my foundation, rigging unmarked propane connections near the electrical panels, and staging dead brush in precise patterns designed to guarantee the fire would jump to Bryn's property. It was clinical. It was chilling. It was federal evidence, frame by frame. Then Bryn made the kind of mistake only arrogance breeds. She showed up with the Channel 7 news crew, standing directly over the accelerant she just paid to have poured. She told Sarah Morgan, "Community safety is my only concern." When public officials ignore fire prevention, innocent neighbors could die. The sheer gall was breathtaking. The federal charges would be biblical. My phone lit up as Pat's network came alive. Walt had already photographed the crew from half a dozen angles. Mrs. Rodriguez recorded every license plate. Even the postal worker got in on it, documenting suspicious activity while dropping off what turned out to be the last mail my house nearly received. Then Fire Marshal Jake Morrison arrived. Bryn's own requested inspector. 30 years in arson investigations had given him an eye like a hawk. Fire Marshal Morrison spotted the setup faster than a prosecutor spots a weak plea deal. He crouched beside the accelerant trails, his jaw tightening. "Judge," he said quietly, tracing the artificial burn patterns with the gloved finger, "this isn't code violation. This is premeditated murder." Later soil tests confirmed DITA industrial-grade accelerants laid with professional precision. Illegal gas lines violated 16 safety codes and carried fingerprints straight out of Sterling Premium's contractor roster. The placements weren't sloppy. They reflected expertise in fire behavior, insurance scams, and how to disguise homicide as an electrical accident. "Whoever planned this knows how to kill and make it look routine," Morrison continued, disgust radiating off him. "This isn't negligence. It's engineered murder for profit." Bryn hit her breaking point when he refused to condemn my home based on her planted evidence. The body cam caught every desperate second of her next move, a clumsy bribery attempt. "Inspector, surely we can handle these a broken bar efficiently," she purred, sliding a fat envelope across his clipboard. "Community safety requires proper documentation and cooperation." The lens captured every word, every gesture, and her frozen face when Morrison informed her that bribing a fire marshal is a federal felony worth a mandatory decade in prison. Pat's network lit up like a switchboard. Within hours, reports surfaced of similar arson prep at 3 other Homessa elderly owners, minority families. Federal agents descended on Pinewood like antibodies hitting infection, cataloging evidence of an organized crime syndicate disguised as a homeowners association. Rebecca Morgan wasted no time. By nightfall, federal warrants were out for Bryn, her husband, and their entire crew. Bank accounts frozen, Sterling Premium locked, and RICO forfeiture proceedings that would strip every stolen dollar. And the irony was exquisite. Bryn's own planted accelerants had become forensic proof of her arson conspiracy, while her bribery stunt stacked new felony counts onto her already toppling legal tower. That night, I sat in Harold's house surrounded by evidence that guaranteed federal prison. The acrid tang of accelerant still hung in the air, but to me it didn't smell of destruction. It smelled like justice being mixed in the crucible. My hands trembled as I realized just how close I'd come to being nothing more than a corpse in an insurance scam. But Bryn's arrogance had undone her. Every accelerant trail was now federal evidence. Every silenced voice was a sworn witness. Every charge stacked like dominoes falling toward life without parole. Federal surveillance hummed in the background while dawn raid plans took shape. Harold used to say justice delayed wasn't justice denied. Sometimes it was justice being sharpened into a blade. Bryn was about to find out how sharp it could cut. At 3:17 a.m., the blade struck. The explosion tore me from dreams of Harold into firelit reality. I was at Walt's, my own house already declared unsafe, when the blast rattled windows for blocks. From his window, I watched 28 years of memories ignite. Our retirement kitchen, our shared bedroom, the memorial garden where his ashes rest, heater reduced to roaring orange daylight. Denver fire cordoned off a 3-block radius. Whoever lit this blaze hadn't been sloppy. They'd engineered a controlled demolition disguised as an accident, the timing calibrated to maximize insurance payout. But Bryn's hubris had triggered the perfect trap. Federal arson investigator Marcus Webb pulled me aside as thermal imaging painted the truth. "Judge, "This wasn't random," he said. "These accelerant highways were laid by professionals. Someone wanted you data and wanted it to look like bad wiring." The evidence survived the inferno. "My fireproof system captured everything." Sterling Premium's crew entering at 2:45 a.m. Bryn's husband hauling accelerants at 3:10. And then came the smoking gun. Insurance investigator Jennifer Park produced the paperwork. Bryn had filed preliminary claims at 2:30 a.m., 47 minutes before the fire even started. She submitted damage claims for her house spreading from your property before your house was burning, Park said, her voice sharpened with satisfaction. "That's not foresight, that's premeditated murder in writing." The community's response was immediate. Neighbors rallied before dawn, arriving with blankets, coffee, and outrage so raw that federal agents began taking witness statements on the spot. Mrs. Rodriguez clutched my hands, tears cutting down her cheeks. "Mija, she tried to kill you. We all saw her planning this." Then came the moment that would be replayed in legal legend. Bryn Ashworth Sterling showed up at the fire scene, designer athleisure, full makeup, full sympathy, and a performance so shameless it bordered on parody. At 4:30 a.m., she stood 50 feet from the ruins she'd just torched, cameras rolling. "This tragic accident proves why our home must enforce strict safety standards," she told Channel 7, voice thick with crocodile grief. Judge Blackwood's refusal to comply with inspections may have contributed to this devastating loss. What she didn't know, FBI mix captured every syllable. Federal marshals already had dawn warrants prepped, and prosecutors were practically salivating. The financial investigation unraveled her empire in hours. $340,000 stolen from HOA coffers had funded professional arsonists. Her house, insured for $2.8 million despite an $800,000 purchase price, was poised for obscene payouts. Even worse, she had filed pre-damage claims 47 minutes before my home ignited a documentary proof of premeditated homicide. Bank records showed payments to known arsonists. Cell data placed both Sterlings at the ignition point. Insurance paperwork read like a perjury case study. Rebecca Morgan's legal counterstrike was immediate. Federal marshals raided before sunrise, cameras rolling as Bryn and her husband were hauled out in cuffs. Assets frozen, Sterling Premium gutted, RICO invoked. Charges stacked like cordwood. Attempted murder of a federal judge, first-degree arson, insurance fraud, money laundering, conspiracy, civil rights violations. The kind of indictment that doesn't end with years up, it ends with life. That night, sitting in Walt's kitchen, the smoke still clinging to my clothes, it no longer smelled of destruction. It smelled like justice served at maximum temperature. My home was gone. Harold's sanctuary reduced to Auschwitz. His memory lived in the neighbors who'd protected me when bricks and mortar couldn't. Bryn had tried to turn me into an insurance payout. Instead, she'd gift-wrapped the federal case that would bury her and her entire network until archaeologists unearthed their bones. 7 days later, she walked into my courtroom in an orange jumpsuit. Gone were the designer outfits and stage makeup. Shackles replaced polish. The irony was so perfect. It felt like Harold himself had scripted it from beyond. The courtroom overflowed. Federal marshals, FBI agents, prosecutors, insurance investigators, victims all packed in, with overflow watching via live stream outside. Cameras from Channel 7 lined the aisles. The Colorado Attorney General sat in the front row, scribbling notes for future civil rights legislation. And most importantly, 17 families Bryn had terrorized represent to Mrs. Rodriguez, the Johnsons and their disabled son, the elderly forced from their home mesa, all waiting to watch her reckoning. Judge Patricia Morrison opened with solemn gravity. The people of Colorado versus Bryn Kinzia, also known as Bethany Sterling, also known as Rebecca Ashworth, also known as Sandra Mitchell. The list of aliases took half a minute. The charges took 4: attempted murder of a federal judge, arson, fraud across multiple states, laundering, conspiracy, RICO, identity theft, witness tampering, civil rights violations. Bryn's public defender, unlucky soul that he was, asked for bond based on community ties. Federal prosecutor Amanda Stevens rose like a lioness with a fresh kill. "Your Honor," she said, voice smooth as a blade, "the defendant has lived under 6 identities in 4 states, stolen over $4 million, and destroyed 15 communities. She attempted to murder a sitting federal judge by firebombing her home, then went on television to blame the victim. The gallery erupted in murmurs of outrage. Marshals shifted, hands near cuffs, and then Bryn made her fatal error. "Your Honor," she said, turning toward me with eyes full of unbroken arrogance, "Judge Blackwood has abused her position to orchestrate a vendetta. This prosecution is nothing but judicial harassment dressed up as justice." The silence was absolute, heavy enough to crush bone. Federal agents exchanged glances that promised new charges. Prosecutors scribbled notes. Victims held their breath. Judge Morrison leaned forward, her voice forged from 20 years on the federal bench. "Miss Mackenzie, you stand accused of attempting to murder a federal judge by burning her house while she slept. You embezzled hundreds of thousands from community funds. You terrorized the elderly and vulnerable while hiding under false names. You filed fraudulent insurance claims totaling millions. And you dare call this prosecution harassment?" She let the words hang like a noose in the courtroom air. "The evidence against you is overwhelming. A security footage of the arson, recorded bribery attempts, documented harassment campaigns, financial ledgers mapping theft to the penny, and insurance filings so riddled with lies they amount to perjury in every federal circuit. You are not the victim of a vendetta. You are a domestic terrorist who targeted a federal judge's community with systematic destruction." Then Judge Morrison delivered the line that would be quoted in law reviews for decades. "Furthermore, this court has reviewed evidence that you've destroyed 15 communities and displaced more than 200 families with identical fraud schemes. Your pattern of targeting elderly and minority residents constitutes systematic civil rights violations. This will be prosecuted to the fullest extent of federal law." The mask slipped. Bryn's face collapsed as the reality of stacked life sentences crushed through her delusion. Her attorney whispered about plea bargains, but the evidence was so absolute it might as well have been carved in granite. Bond was denied, Morrison ruled, her voice sharp as a gavel strike. "The defendant poses an extreme flight risk and remains a clear and present danger to the community." Applause thundered through the gallery. Federal marshals didn't bother silencing it. Mrs. Rodriguez wept openly. Walt punched the air like his team had just won the World Series. 17 families who had lived under Bryn's reign of terror finally tested justice. Served hot. As marshals led Bryn away in chains, she turned, eyes blazing. "This isn't over, Judge. You'll never prove I targeted you." The room froze. I rose, robes heavy with authority, and spoke the words that sealed her fate. "Mrs. Mackenzie, the court notes your admission of targeted harassment as evidence of premeditated intent. Thank you for removing any remaining trace of reasonable doubt." That was the end of Bryn Ashworth Sterling. 2 years later, I stood in my rebuilt kitchen, watching Cardinals at Harold's Memorial Theater while Bryn lived out life without parole in a concrete cell. My morning coffee carried the taste of perfect justice. The trials became legends of prosecutors' dreams, defense attorneys' nightmares. Federal juries took 3 hours and 47 minutes to convict both Ashworth Sterlings on every count. Apparently, most of that was lunch. Bryn received life without parole for the attempted murder of a federal judge, stacked with consecutive sentences for arson, fraud, and civil rights violations, ensuring she'd never breathe free air again. Her husband collected 25 years for conspiracy, ensuring Sterling Premium Builders was buried forever. The $3.2 million seized under RICO paid victims across 4 states, marking the largest HOA fraud restitution in American history. Every family terrorized by Bryn's schemes received compensation plus punitive damages that rewrote legal precedent. But the deeper victory lived in Pinewood itself. Our shattered neighborhood transformed into a model community studied in law schools. Walt Henderson, unanimously elected HOA president, installed transparency measures that made theft impossible. Residents gained new protections. Fines capped at $50 without community approval, monthly financials published online, mandatory mediation before lawsuits, and most importantly, any board member caught targeting by race, age, or income was automatically removed. The reforms ignited a movement. Colorado passed the Pinewood Protection Act, requiring HOA transparency and state oversight. 15 other states soon followed. Millions of Americans now live safe from the next Bryn Mackenzie. Harold's legacy grew. The Judge Harold Blackwood Memorial Scholarship Fund, fueled by documentary rights, book sales, and nationwide donations, across $750,000. Maria Rodriguez, once Bryn's victim, now held a Harvard Law acceptance letter in her hands, ready to fight for vulnerable communities nationwide. Every year, the Pinewood Justice Festival drew thousands, celebrating victory over corruption with music, food, and workshops that taught neighborhoods how to document harassment, track embezzlement, and coordinate with federal investigators. Pat Donnelly's sessions on financial forensics became standing room only, leading to 41 arrests of HOA predators across the country. From my bench, my reputation grew. National recognition for judicial integrity under siege led to lectures, keynotes, and eventually, a permanent mark. The American Bar Association established the Blackwood Award, honoring judges who defend community rights without surrendering judicial ethics. Evil had tried to burn us to ashes. Instead, it forged law, legacy, and justice that would outlast lifetimes. The awards and recognition mattered, yes, but the true victory was personal. Gavel had fully recovered, now patrolling our rebuilt sanctuary with feline sovereignty that could have cowed federal marshals. The memorial garden bloomed brighter than ever, Harold's roses thriving in soil enriched not just by nutrients, but by the love of a community that had refused to break. That evening, the golden wash of sunset poured through new windows as I reviewed scholarship applications, while Gavel surveyed his kingdom from the armchair throne. Outside, Pat tended her victory garden, Walt sat on the porch teaching neighborhood kids the harmonica. Families laughed together in front yards that Bryn's reign of terror had once silenced. Sirens and confrontation had been replaced with children's voices and neighborly conversation, a living reminder that justice isn't only punishment, it's protection, it's healing, it's hope. And here's the message for anyone still battling HOA tyrants or small-time suburban despots. Document everything, organize your numbers. Never let intimidation drive you into silence, because when good people fight back, your horror story can become the case law that saves someone else. Drop a comment below with your own HOA nightmare, because you're not alone in this fight. And make sure to hit subscribe, because next week we're going after a tax assessor who thought he could steal an entire neighborhood for personal profit. Spoiler: the federal charges were exquisite. Together, we're proving that communities can rise, justice can win, and predators can be erased permanently. That's a wrap for today's HOA Secrets. If you enjoyed watching Karma in action, hit like, share your story, and subscribe so you don't miss what comes next.